Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage author of Inverse Cowgirl, Alicia Roth Weigel, in conversation with Schuyler Bailar.
We were a little early for that, huh?
Yeah, well, we're ahead of the curve in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
you know?
we are. That's true.
We're excited to be here. Hi, everybody. We're very excited to invite you into the conversation, so I just want to really make sure to plug the Slido. We do want you to ask questions, and
Yes.
I will be asking the questions that you all ask on the Slido, so feel free to put those in at any time. Alicia, I'm really excited that you're here.
Yeah.
When you said that you were coming, I was so excited to be able to have this conversation with you. Let's jump right in. I think one of the sort of universal experiences, maybe universal is too strong a word, when we're kids is learning about gender, actually,
Yeah.
right? Or being, I'm going to say, indoctrinated about gender.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the first things we're taught is this is a boy and this is a girl and these are girls' toys, these are boys' toys, right? And that doesn't end up being comprehensive. So tell us a little bit about your experience and coming into gender and kind of in the relationship to being intersex as well.
Yeah, so I think just to level set with people, because I think we often use sex and gender interchangeably as words when they're actually not necessarily the same thing. So to be trans is to have a gender identity that is not aligned with the sex that you were assigned at birth. Sex meaning the physical characteristics, everything from chromosomes to hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, the physical kind of tangible aspects of your body that lead doctors to assign you to a certain gender. And at this point, I think as a society, we understand that sexuality is not binary. You're not just gay or straight. There's this whole spectrum in between. People are starting to understand that gender is also not binary. You're not just a man or a woman. There's this whole spectrum. But what society is just starting to grapple with is that sex is also not necessarily binary. Not all of our bodies are born physically with parts that fit neatly into those male and female categories on a birth certificate. And so, yeah, I was both born a girl. I was assigned female at birth, and I was born intersex, so with a lot of physical manifestations that don't align with everyone else who was assigned female at birth. And I think from the very beginning, there was this desire in my family to help me to feel normal so that I wouldn't feel othered. And I think so many parents have that inclination. They just don't want their kid to be made fun of. It's the same justification that's used for telling queer people to stay in the closet or for don't ask, don't tell in the military. It's the same justification why people might be afraid if they find their child, you know, who is assigned male at birth, like dressing in heels in their closet or trying on their makeup or whatever, because it doesn't, I think most parents, unfortunately not all parents, but most parents, I think, want their kid to be safe and happy in the world. Right. And I think that drives this desire to just raise a normal child. And unfortunately, based on the way I was born, my childhood was never going to be normal. But I immediately started receiving messages from my parents and from doctors that would try to shove me in that normal box.
Right.
So I remember hearing all the time from my mom, like, oh, your favorite outfit as a kid was you had this skirt and you never wanted to wear pants. You always wanted to wear dresses, and your favorite colors were pink and purple. And I obviously like pink. But I feel like I always have this question of like how much of that was real versus what I was fed, because I was also fed these ideas by the doctors, where the doctors would say, oh, don't worry, we're going to give you these pills so that you can be just a normal girl, and so you can find a good husband one day, and so that you never have to tell anyone who you are. And it's like, so really looking back, it's hard to grapple with understanding how much of who I am is who I actually am versus who I was told to be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm thinking also about the word intersex and
Yeah.
the power that that labels can lend
Yep.
us if we use them in a way that works for us, right? And in the book, you talk about learning the word intersex way later than when gender was
Yep.
talked about or indoctrinated or sort of given to you as a kid.
Yeah.
What words did you use other than being told not to talk about it?
Yeah. So I was told from when I was very young that I had complete androgen insensitivity, which we call it CAIS for short. And what that basically means is that my body is insensitive to androgens. It's insensitive to quote unquote male hormones. And I put that in quote unquote because everyone, generally, most people have testosterone, whether you're a male or a female. Or
and
in
testosterone
between.
is an androgen.
Testosterone is an androgen, a male hormone, but my body is insensitive to that hormone. So if you gave me a shot of testosterone, my body would convert a lot of that to estrogen, and the rest of it I would just urinate out. I would just pee it out. My body doesn't know what to do with androgens. It's why I look as femme as I do, despite the fact that I have XY chromosomes and was born with internal testes, because I came with this quote unquote male blueprint of XY chromosomes, but in utero, my body was like, we don't know what to do with these androgens, we're just gonna go this way instead. So I like to say that I've been kind of a contrarian since I was in utero, and I see these arbitrary rules that you're supposed to follow, and I'm like, nah, I'm good, like I'm just gonna go my own direction. And I think I was always told that I had complete androgen insensitivity, and that I was a disorder, and that I was being fixed. And that implies that there was something wrong with me.
Right.
When my body would have developed totally naturally on its own had I been left alone. There is a risk that I could have gotten testicular cancer one day. Based on our current research, it's somewhere between 1% and 5%, which I hate to break it to you, but anyone in the audience who has testicles, you could also get testicular cancer one day. I hope that never happens, but anyone born with any body part could get cancer one day. We could all get skin cancer one day. You don't see them out skinning us.
Yeah.
But I was told that I might get testicular cancer one day, and so they were going to remove my testes. And when you're a parent, hearing that, like my kid could get cancer one day, you listen to whatever the doctors are telling you. Unfortunately, again, it was not the full picture. And by removing my testes when I was an infant, they put my body into hormone withdrawal prematurely. And so people are fighting puberty blockers for kids in their early teens, in their tweens, whatever. They removed my hormone producing organs when I was an infant. So these same politicians, these same people who are fighting gender affirming care for trans people are more than fine forcing it prematurely on intersex kids. And I think what it shows is that it's really not about what's healthy for individuals. It's all about what society deems normal. And society doesn't think trans kids are normal. And so they say prevent them from accessing things that affirm who they are but make us uncomfortable. And the same thing with intersex kids. They don't think intersex kids are normal. And so they say, oh, I'm uncomfortable looking at this child that falls in between what I'm comfortable with. And so force these procedures and these hormones and these surgeries on them to make them normal. And so, yeah, I never received messaging that was like, you're intersex, there's a lot of people all around the world like you can find community, you can find just people who have a shared live experience with you. And to grow up your whole life feeling so alone, like you're a freak and like there's no one like you out there, and only ever being told about this huge part of your identity when you're being put under anesthesia by research doctors, or when you're being told by a doctor to not tell your family and friends because you'll be made fun of. It's a really isolating experience.
I mean, I think it sounds deeply painful.
Yeah.
And one of the things you talk about in the book is also your mental health and how that impacted your mental health. You talk about different ways you coped with trying to align yourself with womanhood, and I don't know if extreme is the right way to put it, but sort of in like a way that was really trying to set your feet down in womanhood. And you talk about that as a relationship with also not sort of worrying people would discover that maybe there's a different history that you had with your body and with gender. Talk about when you were able to grab the word intersex, right? And actually empower yourself through that word. Because I know, for me as a trans person, finding the word transgender was hugely liberating.
Totally.
Because there was a word I could find, right? I could say, oh, this is why all
You
of these
always
other
knew you were different,
right?
but you didn't have anything to help connect the dots of like, this is who I am.
Yeah, so tell us about that moment when you found the word intersex, and maybe paint a picture of how that actually occurred for you.
Yeah. So even before finding the word intersex, when you said I would have all these ways of trying to like put that stake in the ground, like I am a woman, I just want to say that anyone who is forced to hide who they are for their entire life, that is inherently unhealthy for your mental health and your physical health. So
we have research that supports it from the psych world.
So much, we're in a science center. There's so much scientific research that supports that. So setting the forced surgeries aside, setting the hormones aside, setting all of these other pieces aside of my experience, even simply the act of having to hide who you are for your whole life has negative health. It's detrimental for your health. And so that led me to a lot of negative coping skills. I used to drink a lot and do a lot of drugs growing up, and I used to treat sex more as an act of validating that I was a woman rather than trying to promote my own pleasure, because I felt that if I was desirable in the male gaze, then that's what made me a woman. In a weird way, it was also like when I was a kid and I used to play with Barbies, it was like I made all my Barbies pregnant, which I write about in the book, because I was like, this is what a woman is supposed to be, even though I knew I could never be pregnant because I don't have the reproductive organs to be pregnant. It's like we receive, and this is something I want to say too, all individuals receive so much messaging about what gender is supposed to mean in our lives, regardless of whether we're trans or intersex. So sex traits, like I'm talking about, from chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive anatomy, external genitalia, all of those things, the discrepancy from the norm, or even the conversation about a norm, that's not unique to intersex people. So everyone has sex traits. Some cisgender women have big boobs and some are flat-chested. Some cisgender men can grow a full beard and some barely grow peach fuzz. All of our traits exist on a spectrum. All of us, every single person. It's just intersex people happen to be closer to the center of that spectrum. And I just want to reiterate that to everyone in the audience. We all have bodies. That's the only thing all human beings have in common. And that's pretty special and like pretty awesome. And the weirdest part is that's like the one thing we're all afraid to talk about.
That's very true. And I think that a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to categorize, right?
Totally.
Going back to the concept of like how we form these gender ideals, and in research we can call them also appearance ideals, how people are supposed to quote unquote look, and the pressures to look certain ways. Oftentimes those pressures affect marginalized folks more. But one of the things I think is really interesting, and this is where your book is, I think, expansive to not, like, it's not just for intersex folks to read. In fact, I think I'd be more excited if non-intersex folks read it, because I think more people need to get on this train. But one of the things I think that you call in is also a universality of experience, right? Just now you said a lot of what you did in childhood was trying to get closer to your womanhood, trying to validate your womanhood, trying to use the metrics that society gave you of womanhood, whether that be sex, whether that be validation from others, the male gaze, what have you. I would bet that most women, intersex, cis, or whatever, right, have experienced those things too.
Totally. Well, and we talk about how like breast augmentation is gender affirming surgery, regardless of what your gender is.
Right.
Or like for intersex people, most of my life I took birth control because birth control is estrogen and sometimes a little progesterone, depending on the formulation of it. But I took birth control most of my life because they took my internal testes that would have produced testosterone that my body didn't absorb, so it would have converted that into estrogen. And by removing my testes, that means that I was in estrogen withdrawal. I was in withdrawal of the hormones my body needed. So I've had to take external hormones my whole life. And a lot of times growing up, that was just birth control, because before transgender healthcare became more normalized, And there was like a shortage of even options for like finding hormone care, whether or not you're transgender. So I took birth control for most of my life. Now, people can get birth control for contraceptive purposes, and they can get that covered by insurance, or sometimes not even by insurance. It's covered in certain states, certain cities. I have to pay out of pocket for my hormones, my same exact hormones, because I need them for a different reason, because I can't get pregnant. So I'm not using them for contraceptive purposes. I'm using them for a different purpose. But just to reiterate, I wouldn't have needed these drugs had they not mutilated my body in the first place. So because the doctors created a problem that didn't exist, I now have to pay for hormones that cisgender women get for free.
I mean, I think it's so striking when we think about just like the way biology works too, because I want to
Yeah.
go back. We're in the Science Museum, so
Yeah.
bear with me for a second. I'm gonna give you a little science thing that you said very quickly, but for people who don't know, testosterone and estrogen are both hormones that are formed from cholesterol, and the pathway goes from testosterone to estrogen with a chemical or an enzyme called aromatase. And so your body has that. It is able to take testosterone, make it into estrogen, which is
Yes.
so cool.
So cool.
Right? That's
It's like
amazing.
a superpower.
Yeah, and actually, by the way, all of our bodies have this, right? If I
Totally.
take too much testosterone, it will get
It will
converted
start converting it
into
to
estrogen, right?
It's just a different threshold.
Exactly, which is
Right.
fascinating. So this is just another reminder to folks, there is so much diversity within our bodies, and our bodies actually do know how to deal with a lot of these different diversities. And the common argument against trans people, against intersex people, and just like the kind of concept that biological sex and gender are actually spectrums, right, is this whole thing of like, well, it's not natural. Actually, our bodies
It's
have
all
blueprints
natural.
for making this incredibly natural, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, and the fact that we all start out so genetically similar for the first, I believe, 7 weeks of sexual development. So, and this is again, like we're in a science center. We're going to talk about bodies openly and without shame. So, scrotum and labia are very genetically similar, and in surgeries used for gender reassignment or gender confirmation, they often will use the tissue because it is so similar.
Yep.
And it's because it starts out genetically similar too. It just gets positioned sort of differently based on all of these factors that your body's telling you, which is a combination of your chromosomes,
hormones.
your hormones, all these different things. But we're all, again, like very similar. We just like receive slightly different messages. And like, who's to say that if our body's giving us one of those messages, that that's a wrong message? Who's to say that that message is unnatural? Whether it's a physical message or a message inside our brain and inside our heart and inside of our soul, our body is giving us a message about who we are supposed to be. And if that's what our body is naturally telling us, who is society to tell us that that's unnatural or unscientific or wrong?
Yeah, I think that's so powerful, right? Messages either from our soul or from our biology, whatever we are hearing,
Yeah.
I think are really innate and special messagings that we have to listen to, right? And I think
Yes.
trans and intersex folks are called to listen to that maybe more obviously, but I think people who are not trans or intersex can also be called to listen
Yeah.
to those messages within ourselves.
Yeah.
Let's talk about bodies in a slightly different way.
Okay.
Your book is structured with tattoos. So
Yeah.
all of your tattoos are a title of the chapter, which I thought was a fascinating way to sort of walk through your life. And I think you and I talked about this before, but your book isn't just about being intersex. It's
Yeah.
very expansive about your life and your experiences, and I think you call them transgressions, but just being a human, right?
Yeah.
And before, when we were backstage, you said, "You know what, Schuyler? I'm done being what other people want me to be. I just
Yeah.
want to be myself."
Yeah.
And I really feel that throughout the book. I was telling you, I hear your voice the entire time I read your
Yeah.
book. So tell us a little bit about how you came to decide to do the tattoos as like a way, because it is body, and
Yeah.
intersex folks are often reduced to body,
Yep.
but it's also not body as intersex. It's just body, and it's like your
Yeah.
relationship with your body. So I love that. Talk about
Well,
that.
intersex people, often we end up dissociating from our bodies, which I imagine so many trans people do too, probably, until they affirm their gender. Because, well, for intersex people, when you're treated like a circus freak and like a lab rat and all of these things, you end up having a really complex relationship with your own body. And one way that many if not all of us that I've spoken with, and I've spoken with intersex people around the world, we often end up learning to dissociate to cope, which is literally disconnecting from our own bodies. And so you almost feel like this out-of-body experience, or like things could happen to you and you're not processing it in the way that a non-intersex person or an endosex person, that's the term for a non-intersex person, would. So I write about this in my book too, that I'm also a sexual assault survivor, but when I was raped, I didn't experience that in the same way that many people who are sexually assaulted do, because my whole life I had had doctors poking and prodding at my genitalia and putting me under anesthesia to look at my junk without my consent, and all of these other experiences of violating my bodily autonomy and my boundaries to where I didn't have any concept of what those boundaries were. Yeah. And I had to learn all of that through a lot of therapy, through some plant medicine, through a lot of different ways. And one way I talk about this is also through getting tattoos. So how many of y'all have tattoos? Anyone in the audience have tattoos? Yeah. So a lot of people think it really hurts, and I guess it does. I think it feels really good. And usually when they're done, I'm like, oh, like you're really done? You don't want to just like keep going like without the ink in there or something? But I think it's because I can feel it, and the physical act of getting it like really brings me into my body. I'm like, I can feel, like I'm here. Like this is my body and I can feel this. And then the act of having it afterwards also is part of reclaiming my body, because I was told my whole life that my body was shameful and inherently a problem simply for the way I was born. And tattoos enable me to reclaim my body and be like, well, if y'all don't think I'm beautiful, if y'all don't think I'm okay, like these are things I find beautiful, and I'm gonna get that inked onto my skin. It's literally like reclaiming my own skin with things that I find beautiful or that feel like me. Not what I've been told to be, not what I've been designed or crafted to be by doctors and by parents and by society, but what is Alicia? And so that kind of, I've heard actually from trans friends of mine too, that a lot of people find tattoos to be a helpful embodiment practice to feel connected with themselves. And it's also helpful that each of my tattoos, and you can't really see any of them, they're intentionally like easily concealable, because living in Texas and like speaking in the legislature, you get like judged if you come in looking a certain way or whatever. So luckily I can hide most of mine, which is helpful in certain circumstances. But I have a lot of them, and each of them have a lot of meaning tied to them. And so my book is chronological, but it's also organized where I'm talking about these larger themes that each of my tattoos correlate to.
Do you have a favorite tattoo? It's an annoying question, but I'm
that's
curious.
a good question. I mean, I like a lot of my tattoos.
That's good. I'm glad.
Yeah, I like all of them actually. I haven't had the desire to get any of them removed yet. I do have like some that look better than others. I have one on my hip that's already starting to fade a little bit, but that actually might be my favorite because it's the last 3 lines of a tattoo or of a poem that someone wrote me in Peru, and it's part of this chapter in my book called Poem, which is my favorite chapter. And I have a few poems that I've written in it, but it's all based on this poem that someone else wrote for me as well. And you'll have to read the book. Obviously, I hope you all read the book, but it's complicated. I got in an argument with an alt-right conservative pundit. It got millions of views around the world, and people started sending me death threats and poems from everywhere. So it was kind of like I got a lot of positive and a lot of negative, but I think the reason that that's my favorite chapter is because I also talk about being bipolar in that chapter. And so you mentioned that my book is not just about intersex stuff, it's about so many different things. And I think what's interesting about being intersex and bipolar is that being intersex, my body's in between what's considered normal. So like you're supposed to be like a man or a woman, and like or male or female, and I'm born physically in between. And being bipolar, I'm outside of what's considered normal. Like you're supposed to be at this like homeostasis or whatever, and I'm considered like too manic or too depressive, like too outside of like the norm. And so I feel like both physically and mentally, my whole life, I've felt outside of or othered from what's supposed to be normal. But I also talk about in that chapter how I actually consider those things my greatest strengths. And you'll have to like read more about it as to why, but yeah, that chapter in particular, I think is really meaningful to me.
Yeah, well, let's press into that sort of.
Yeah.
I liked that distinction too in the book about bipolar being the poles and intersex being the middle.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you talk about as well, and I think this is something that I relate a lot to as well, is we can call it passing privilege. For anybody who doesn't know what that means, it means being read as what people would consider somewhat a dominant identity, right? So me being not read as transgender, you being not read as intersex, somebody who's queer being read as straight, whatever, right? Being read as a dominant identity can afford you privilege. It can also be erasure.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that, at least for me, it does is it makes me feel I don't belong anywhere because
Yeah.
I'm not cisgender and I don't fit in with cisgender people in that way. But a lot of trans people don't consider me trans enough, and so I get stuck.
Yeah.
And I, as a mixed race person, that's also my experience,
Totally.
right? So I read that was part of your experience, and so I want you to talk about that, but then especially with the relationship to privilege and how you use that in betweenness.
Totally. Well, so first off, that's where the title of the book comes from, actually. It is a play on the reverse cowgirl, which for those of y'all don't know is a sex position. And the reason why I clarify that is because I was on CBS Mornings with Gayle King, Oprah's best friend Gayle, recently, and she didn't know what reverse cowgirl was. So I had to explain that to her, and then she went around and she was asking all the cameramen and all the gaffers and all the lighting people. She's like, "Do you know what reverse cowgirl is?" And they were like, "Yes, Gayle, we all know what reverse cowgirl is." So anyway, Inverse Cowgirl is a play on reverse cowgirl, because I'm intersex in Texas, so instead of reverse cowgirl, inverse cowgirl. So that's like what it means at the highest level. But also what I talk about is anyone can feel like an inverse cowgirl at certain points, because above anything else, it means feeling like the inverse or the reverse of like what is expected of you by society. And I think regardless of what lived experience we're born into, we all have had moments where we feel like, as you mentioned, too much of this or not enough of that, like we don't fit these prescribed boxes that we're supposed to fit into. And I think what I want us all to remember is that the boxes don't actually exist. We do. We are all physically here. Whether you're getting a tattoo gun to remind you of that, or you're like pinching your skin or whatever, I can see all of you in front of me. Like we are all here. The boxes, you could cross that out on a piece of paper and rewrite it and it would be a different thing, right? And so I think it's like we need to question like all of these things that we've been told, because the boxes don't exist, we do. So that's the first thing. But also being an inverse cowgirl, it's not only being the inverse of what's expected, but also being a cowgirl, it's like you're on the frontier and you're like pushing the boundary of what's considered to be normal. And this is actually something that I watched this TV show about music on Netflix, I think. And the first episode was about T-Pain. And has anyone seen this show? Do y'all know what I'm talking about? No one's seen it? Okay, there's some show on Netflix about music, and the first episode is about T-Pain. And when I was like, it's about T-Pain, I was like, what kind of show is this? And then I ended up sobbing by the end of the episode, because the episode is about how T-Pain started using auto-tune. And everyone was like, T-Pain is ruining music. No one needs to learn how to sing anymore. Like, music is like, what T-Pain was the nail in the coffin for music, like single-handedly destroyed music. And if you're a musician, can you imagine being told that like your art single-handedly ruined all of music for all of time? Like that would be like a really terrible feeling. And so T-Pain was like really bummed. But then it gets worse, because then like 2 years later, Cher is using auto-tune like, do you believe in life after love, and whatever. And then Lil Wayne is using auto-tune, and they're making millions off of auto-tune. And so T-Pain was told that like he was an abomination and he ruined all of music and is shunned from society. 2 years later, people are making millions off of that. And I feel like the intersex movement, it often feels like that, because people don't know what intersex means yet. The way I like to describe it to people is like with trans folks, a lot of people hate trans folks. With intersex folks, we have to describe who we are first and then they hate us. There's like an added layer of like, first I need to like prostrate myself and like share all my childhood trauma with you and give you all these medical definitions, and then you can decide to hate me. And there are a lot of negative ramifications for being visible as well. We talk about how being visible without protections is like a target on your back, which is what the transgender community is experiencing now. And the intersex community, that's gonna be a thing for us too. But I think being the first is always really hard. But as you mentioned, also being able to pass as not being different also comes with a lot of inherent privilege. And so the fact that I look like Tommy Lauren, if any of y'all know, okay, some of y'all know. I'm glad that not all of y'all know who that is, but I look like Aryan Youth Wet Dream, right? Whatever. And like, so I'm very not just cis passing, I'm like very Republican palatable. I'm like very, like I think there's a reason why I wrote my book Inverse Cowgirl, because I'm not only intersex, I'm intersex in Texas. And the reason why it is safe for me to be there doing this work is because I look the way I do. And my ex-boyfriend used to call me a sleeper cell. He's like, you can get into all these places where it's not necessarily safe or comfortable for like a lot of other people in your movement, and people listen to you differently. And so use that, like weaponize your privilege. Don't ignore it. In the beginning, when I first came out and I joined the movement, I tried to ignore it because I think I was like you mentioned, I felt like not intersex enough. But then I was like, actually, this is like really, really powerful. Like I have this opportunity to get into spaces that some of my other friends can't, or where it's not safe for them to do so. And then I have the opportunity to like break that initial barrier and then kind of bring others along. So whether you see me as like a sleeper cell, or Saifa, one of my fellow intersex activist who's a black man, he calls me like the gateway intersex. But like whatever it is, it's like I'm trying to use that privilege, right? Like it's a lot harder to be intersex in Texas than it is in Boston or in Philly or in LA or in New York. And I'm trying to leverage that.
One of the things you talk about in the book is that coalition building, which is using, right,
Yes.
the privilege that you have.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think a lot about. Most of the education work that I've done has been not with community, right? It's not, I don't do most of my work with other trans people or even other intersex or LGBTQIA people. Most of my work is actually with non-LGBTQIA
Yes.
people. And I think there's I don't know, a lot of difficulty in that space, but I also feel like that's a space that for me I love, because it's about building coalition.
Yes.
It's about getting somebody to have that switch that flips for them. That's like, wait.
It's about bridging, which is
Exactly.
what one of my chapters is about, my bridge tattoo, which is covered by my cute little boots, so y'all can't see it. But yeah, it's about being that bridge to people. And that's what I think, like people often, like intersex people come to me all the time and they're asking me, what is my contribution to this movement? What should I do? And I talk about how it's owning who you are and owning your identity and owning what comes naturally to you, and that is going to be the greatest contribution. And so I think you and I like are the bridges to these other communities. And I write about the first sentence of my book is, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't feel like whipping it out. Oh, I could just read it.
Here, let's read it.
Okay.
We've got people being
Yeah.
really present with what's going on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so, and this is the very first sentence after Jonathan Van Ness's preface. So if any of y'all like Queer Eye, JVN did write the foreword to this book and also voices the preface in the audiobook. So you should download that too. But the first sentence. I started writing this book the week that half of the United States lost the rights to their own bodies. These are rights I never had in the first place, even before the reversal of Roe versus Wade, but we'll get to that. I wrote this decidedly progressive memoir all over a deeply red state. My literary journey kicked off in far west Texas, nestled in the beautiful Davis Mountains that separate Marfa from El Paso. It ended in Round Top, a small town in the cow country that lies between Houston and the capital city. Inverse cowgirls like me live all over the Lone Star State, not just in liberal havens like Austin. Intersex people, in fact, span not just the entire South, but approximately 150 million of us live across the country and around the world. This book is a testament to that fact. I look forward to bringing y'all along for the ride. And I think that part's really important too. I mentioned that I'm like an inverse cowgirl and I'm intersex in Texas. I do a lot of work with the healthcare industry because intersex people, we already have a dearth of healthcare in childhood, but once you age out of pediatrics, there's nothing. Like literally there are no doctors that know how to treat your body. So for me, I would have to fly back to the East Coast because there were like 2 or 3 doctors on the Eastern Seaboard who had ever treated intersex patients. Well, they've all treated intersex patients, but that have any idea like how intersex bodies function and how to properly treat intersex patients. And that was a huge expense to me, having to fly back from Texas to the East Coast to see a doctor. I was helping to build an intersex healthcare clinic in Texas, which we built the first ever adult intersex care clinic in the United States in Texas. So don't believe
Very
everything you hear.
Yeah.
And in doing that, though, we ran national surveys for intersex people. We did focus groups with intersex Texans across the whole state, including in places like Lubbock and Amarillo and like rural Texas, where these people are like not out in their families. They are scared to tell their doctors. And one of the responses that we got is even in Austin, there's this intersex woman in Austin who is flying to Japan to get healthcare.
Wow.
She was literally flying to Japan to see a doctor. And so, yeah, I think that first paragraph is important for a variety of reasons. One, it's being like intersex people are everywhere. We need care everywhere. We need recognition everywhere, like not just in these like safe spaces like where we're sitting right now. And that's why I think it is really important for me to be an inverse cowgirl. But also the other thing, and this was back to your original question, is trying to be that bridge. My first sentence was about the reversal of Roe versus Wade. I can't get pregnant. I don't have a uterus or ovaries, but I fought I got my feet wet as an activist in the abortion space.
Right.
And I've always, I cut my teeth as an advocate in the women's movement. And one thing I talk to a lot of my intersex comrades about is that, again, my contribution to this movement, looking the way I do, having the lived experience I do, not just as an intersex person, but as the activist that I am who received the training that I did in the spaces that I did, is that if I can get the women's movement to accept intersex people as part of what they're fighting for, all of a sudden that's not 2% of the world fighting for ourselves in a silo, that's half the world fighting for us. And I think if we all realize that, and I'm gonna speak specifically to women because again, I feel like that's my contribution, like being given this body and this life that I have. If we could understand that stripping us of the decision to make decisions about our bodies, whether it's an intersex or trans person with their healthcare, whether it's a sexual assault survivor with having been raped, whether it's someone who's had access blocked to abortion, whatever it is, all of the things that the women's movement are fighting for is them taking away our ability to make decisions for ourselves about our own bodies. It's all the same thing. It's all the same fight. It all has these different trappings and yes, we need nuanced language and we need to speak about these specific instances because they have manifold laws targeting all these different things. But I think it helps me at least to feel less alone and to feel like part of this broader coalition if I realize that all of our fight is actually exactly the same. If you strip all the complicating factors, we all just want the ability to be like, I was born into this body, let me make my own decisions about what I do with it and what is done with it.
And I think that's one of the most powerful parts of, for me, understanding any social justice movement, which is it really goes back to bodily autonomy.
It does.
And actually just generalized autonomy.
Yes.
And self-determination, right?
Yep.
And the combination of the two, to be able to say, this is who I am and this is what I want to do in my body, and have that be allowed. And I think many people in this country don't have access to either of those things for a myriad of reasons, but they are tricking themselves into thinking that they do when they watch a trans person not get surgery. And they, oh, that's fine. I don't want no trans people getting surgery, or oh, intersex people, yeah, we'll normalize them, right? But they're not realizing that they're also curbing their own ability to exist in their own bodies.
Totally.
So I want to start to wrap us up because I want to pull in the questions from the audience. But my last question for you here, well, I have a lot of questions I didn't get to. I never get to all my questions, but I
talk a lot too.
all good things. I would like to have us have a sort of a directive from you of what can we all
Good
take,
question.
right? Like, what is the best way? I hate this question because I get asked it, but I want you to try.
Yeah.
What's the best way to be an advocate for intersex rights?
I have the simplest answer
Great.
because it's really step one. So as I mentioned, people have to understand what intersex first is before they can decide to hate us. And
hopefully you'll decide.
well, hopefully
join
they will
us.
decide not to hate us, right? But there's the added barrier there.
Sure.
And in order to really understand what intersex means and to understand what we're fighting for, because I wrote a whole book about it, this can't be the only conversation that you're a part of, and mine can't be the only voice that you're hearing.
100%.
I talk all the time about how intersex is not a monolith. Like, so I was part of a movie that led to this book deal in the first place. You can stream it for free on Peacock. It's called Everybody. It was directed by Julie Cohen, who also did the RBG documentary. And that film is about me, an intersex white woman. It's about Saifa, a black intersex man, and it's about River, a Latinx non-binary intersex person. And it shows how we all have very different lived experiences, but there's so much in common. But you're not going to be able to like even scratch the surface of understanding any of it if this is the only time you're hearing about intersex issues.
100%.
So I would encourage you to follow me on social media so that you can find other intersex activists. I'm constantly posting to my story about intersex organizations like Interact, Interconnect, the Intersex Justice Project, Club Intersex. These are orgs that do everything from providing support groups for intersex people, for parents of intersex people. Parents of intersex kids are victims too. They're not provided with enough information to make accurate and affirming decisions for their children. So by following me, you'll be able to learn about all these intersex organizations you can follow, other intersex advocates you can follow. And what you'll learn in the book is, besides being intersex, I'm also a political strategist, and I spent a lot of my time running campaigns. And what I learned is that for a message to sink in, people have to hear it a minimum of 7 times. It takes repetition. So while it's super annoying to get all those text messages, I'm sure y'all are on those text lists where you're like, just stop texting me. There's actually science behind that at the Science Museum. You can't internalize something if you just hear it once. And so the goal is for y'all to be able to become accomplices and allies and to be able to speak on my behalf, because I can't speak in every room and every place around the world. But in order to feel comfortable doing that, you're gonna need to hear this message a lot more times from a lot of different voices and learn all the different nuances of it. So I would say follow me, and by doing that, you'll be able to learn all these other unique voices and organizations that you can hear as well.
I love the bringing in also following you. One, because I follow you and I learn a lot from you. But I think one of the things that social media allows us to do is to invite diversity into normalcy. And when I say normalcy, I don't mean like trying to make something normal. I more mean like, if you are constantly presented with lots of diversity, it's gonna be part of your reality, right? Part of your
1000%.
everyday. And that's just something that maybe we don't have intersex folks in our, well, we probably do, right? Chances are you probably already know intersex people that maybe they don't
And
tell you.
honestly, and we don't chromosomally test all children at birth. There are intersex people that don't find out till their 40s.
Or till they're gone.
Or
I
till
mean,
they're
a lot
gone.
of intersex people don't know that they're intersex ever. There's actually a
Totally.
strong amount of people. So anyways, the point is, I think as you integrate people into your lives, you can do that by proxy, right? Parasocial relationships. Don't have a relationship with people online that they don't know they're having a relationship with. But it's good to interact with people and learn from people that are different from you. And I think that's been, for me, one of the best parts about social media is I follow so many people that I would never have necessarily met in person. And I get to have that be part of what's normal in my life. And that will help you also invite an expansiveness to what biological sex is, what gender is, right? What is the sort of full breadth of humanity? Because we don't have access to that a lot of the times in our daily lives.
Totally.
All right, we've got questions.
Okay.
So we're gonna shift to the audience questions. Audience, if you would like to ask questions, please do so with the Slido thing. The technical term, Slido thing.
Slido thing.
Okay, so the first question, there's a funny one, but I'm gonna wait. That's gonna be the last one.
Okay.
How did you get started? You talked a little bit about this already, but tell us a little bit more about how you got started in advocacy and activism, because it wasn't in intersex rights.
No, it was not.
And do you have advice for others who would be interested in joining you in your efforts and otherwise advocating for identities?
Yeah.
How'd you get started, and what's your advice?
Yeah, how I started. I started in little ways before I knew I was starting. So I was experiencing discrimination in the workplace, and I was fighting some of those specific instances, like with middle management, and even just like the act of actually doing what we all talk about in my day-to-day. Like that's where it all started. Where it started more formally was I was in a career that I didn't care about. I was really not passionate about it, and I ended up spending all my time outside of work volunteering with gender equity organizations, and I became known as the person who shows up and does the work. And so I had never studied any of that in school. I never had like formal training. I just would show up and ask what these organizations needed as a volunteer, and I would be there relentlessly. And when you do that, you start to be associated with these spaces. And so when people are like, oh, do you know anyone who does this? Oh, like Alicia's often around, right? And so for a long time, it was uncompensated, it was informal, it was not like I had like some activist training course or something like that. But because of doing all of that, I actually got tapped to help develop activist training courses. There was a former state senator named Wendy Davis in the state of Texas who became famous for leading what we call the people's filibuster. And I'll do a brief divergence because this story is just really cool if y'all don't know. Do any of y'all know who Wendy Davis is? Have you heard the name? Okay, cool. Yeah, we see some clapping in the audience. So Wendy was a state senator in Texas who ended up filibustering for 16 hours to kill a piece of legislation that would have shut down all of the abortion clinics across Texas. This is back when we had abortion clinics in Texas, which we don't right now, unfortunately. But Wendy, filibustering, for people who don't know, that means you have to speak without stopping. And it basically runs out the clock when they're trying to pass a bill. And if someone keeps talking, then they can't vote on that bill. So it's literally running out the clock so that they can't do what they're supposed to do. They can't vote on that bill. And so Wendy had prepared to do that with this bad bill that would have blocked all reproductive freedom in Texas. And so she was reading for 16 hours the stories of people across Texas who had had abortions. Wow. And she had like binders and binders, and she was reading their stories. And in Texas, there's a 3-strike rule. So the first strike, and 3 strikes and then you're done filibustering. They kick you out, whatever, they can vote. The first strike they gave her, because one of her colleagues gave her a back brace. Because when you're filibustering, you're not allowed to sit down. You're not allowed to pee. You're not allowed to do anything. She was wearing a diaper and a catheter because she knew she was gonna have to speak for 16 hours. So a colleague gave her a back brace. That was strike 1. They had some other BS, strike 2. So there were 2 strikes, but they didn't make it to the 3rd strike because this happened to be the day. It was the first day that the Texas legislature was ever live streamed. So people were watching from around the country and around the world, including myself. I had never been to Texas, but I was watching this because I'm like a feminist. And I was like, this lady is a badass. And so I was watching, and people like me were watching, and people were flying into Austin, where I live, the state capital, were driving in from all over Texas, packing the Capitol to support Wendy, to the point where it was so packed to the gills and people were screaming so loud that at the time, the midnight deadline of this bill, everyone was screaming so loud that they couldn't take a voice vote. And so the bill failed because of the people's voices. Wow. And so that's why we call it the people's filibuster in Texas. And that woman asked me to move to Texas to start a nonprofit with her to train the next generation of young women activists in Texas. And so that was something I couldn't say no to. And so that's where I got started. But for anyone who wants to know how to get started, to get noticed by someone like Wendy, you got to do the grunt work first. You got to be the squeaky wheel in your office that, like, when you see something, say something. You got to be the one that when organizations are like, we need volunteers, you got to show up. You got to be the volunteer. If you show up relentlessly everywhere, you will get noticed, and you'll get noticed by the right people. And I'm sure you do this. I spend so much of my time mentoring people, and it's really when I see people that are like doing the work before you get the fancy title associated with it, let alone the paycheck, you'll find someone who's like willing to mentor you through that process and help lift you into it as well.
All incredible stories. I will
Yeah.
offer an unsolicited addition, which is also take care of yourself. I think
Yes.
both of us, you write about this in the book, and I have talked about this in my life, but both of us have experienced burnout, have experienced doing too much, have run ourselves to the ground. And I think that is very common for a lot of activists, a lot of people who care a lot about what they do. And I think it's dangerous, right? So I think it's important for us to also be mindful. Whenever anybody asks me about how to be an activist, I say a lot of things that you've said, but then I also say, and take breaks, right?
Well, and in addition to taking breaks, I think there are two types of followers I get when I post something. I'll post something and I'll be like, y'all are working too hard, take a break. And I know half the people, because I know these people, they're not doing the work. They're not working hard, but they're taking that message and they're being like, oh, okay, I'm good. Like, I can take a break. And then there's the people like us who are doing way more than they should and are not listening to that message and being like, whatever. So I think part of it is also like being realistic with yourself and like you taking breaks and knowing what you have capacity for, but also like not feeling like this isn't my fight or like relying on the people like us to fight it. Because for democracy to function as a system, we all have to participate like over the course of our lifetime. The reason why we have the representatives we do that don't actually represent us is because we're not showing up to even vote. So anyway, I think there's a balance between take care of yourself, don't work too hard, and like having a realistic conversation with yourself in the mirror. Like, am I showing up?
Yeah.
Am I showing up?
I think it's a great question. Am I showing up for other people and for myself?
Yes, both.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple questions for time. Parents, as much as you want to share about this, but you talk about your parents in the book and your relationship with your parents and how that evolved with your publicity, I will say, about your identity. The question is, do your parents have guilt on approving your surgery as an infant? How's your relationship with them today? And how can parents and doctors of intersex children advocate advance bodily autonomy? There's another one that's very similar, which is advice for parents finding out that their kid is intersex. So yeah, talk a little bit about your parents and any advice you have for parents.
I think parental guilt is really strong, and it's something that I don't understand because I don't have children, but I think I see it a lot in our community. And those of us who are most vocal and most active, the ones who are writing books, the ones who are writing movies, I would say very few of us have relationships with our parents. And that is not necessarily by our choice. I think one thing I want to make clear is that by advocating for our autonomy, we are not advocating against our parents. I'm the first person to say parents are a victim of a lack of information. It's why a lot of the legislation that we work on as a movement is mandating public education campaigns that target doctors and parents of intersex kids so that they have more information than my parents did, and they can make better informed decisions than mine were able to. But I think it is the relationship between an intersex person and their parents is often very complicated. My advice for parents would be a few things. One, I understand the desire to shield your kid from harm, and so how that translates into a desire to shield them, to literally hide them. And I would say that if you grow up talking to your kid about it all as if it's normal from day one, then it will be normal. We are very powerful at manifesting things in this world, and the answer to bigotry is not to hide victims of bigotry. It is to raise people to not be bigots. The answer to raising people not to be made fun of, raising children not to be made fun of, is not to tell them to lie, to avoid being made fun of. It's to raise kids not to make fun of other kids for being different. So I think have these conversations with your kids. Treat it like it is normal, because it is normal. It's naturally occurring. What other disease is there in the world, disease, disorder, difference, whatever, where people are supposed to lie about it their entire lives? It's very weird. So yeah, normalize it. Be part of the step of normalizing it. And find yourself a parental support group as well. Interconnect is an amazing organization that has support groups not just for intersex kids, but for parents too.
Interconnect, love that.
Yeah.
And also, all y'all who have kids who are not intersex, you can do the same thing. You can talk to your kids about intersex kids. You can talk to your kids about lots of different identities, and you can add that into the frame of normalcy because, right, it's not about teaching kids to hide themselves, it's about teaching kids to be nice to other kids.
Yep.
Right? I think it's a very
Totally.
simple message. Thank you for that. Okay. Can you talk about whether you've seen shifts in the medical establishment towards a more nuanced approach to treating intersex children, i.e. not forcing the binary without consent?
Yes. So I have a twofold answer, and I'll try to keep it quick because I know I tend to ramble. So there are countries, entire countries, that have banned non-consensual and medically unnecessary surgeries on intersex children. Greece, Kenya, Malta. Portugal got really close. I believe it passed out of both sides of parliament and got vetoed by the, not president, what's it called? Prime Minister. Germany has like really stringent restrictions. So there are places around the world where intersex people have full bodily autonomy as far as they're able to enforce that in the medical establishment. In the US, it's been a little bit more complicated. We are a much larger country. We do have 50 states that all have their own state legislatures. It's more complicated to do something like that. So that's part of it. I also think that in the United States, we're a lot farther behind on a lot of issues of human rights than other countries of the world, or than we might like to think of ourselves. And we have a lot of medical allies in the US, and we have doctors who are still doing surgeries on kids and then billing it as something else so that they can't get caught.
Gosh.
Because they're prioritizing a parent's comfort over a child's autonomy. And so I do think part of the answer is legislative, because that puts pressure and it allows for more stringent enforcement. But really, it's all about changing hearts and minds, because people are going to find a way if they want to, and they're going to hide it. So really, it's like we all got to just be part of normalizing the whole conversation so that medicine catches up. Being gay was considered a disorder until very recently. They were trying to electric shock it out of kids. We are also undergoing conversion therapy, just using scalpels instead of shocks.
That's a very clear way to put it, and I appreciate that, because I think that people are missing that, right? They're missing, we're lying to ourselves, trying to preserve some, fallacy of normalcy, quote unquote, that's really been given to us to control us, right? And to control everybody, because anybody's characteristics that don't fit these really narrow boxes of what a man or a woman or male or female are supposed to be, right? Anybody who deviates from that in any way has been bullied, right?
Well,
everybody here has been limited by
and
gender.
Scapegoats are really powerful. And so when in Texas we're arguing about what's inside little kids' pants, which is like a really weird thing for society to be talking about all the time in the first place. But
absolutely,
when we're arguing about that, then we're not talking about how we lose power every time the temperature drops below freezing, or the fact that it was 110 degrees in Austin for 60 straight days this summer, and we're experiencing historic drought and all of these things. So when they can find or create little flashy objects to put in little kids' pants, then that distracts us from all the actual issues that we have in society.
100%. They love their scapegoats.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna do one more serious question, and then we'll close with the silly one.
Yeah.
I'm just there's two that are really good, and I have to decide between them.
I'll
Okay,
answer them quickly.
Oh, you want to do it quickly?
Yeah,
Okay, we'll do a
we'll do
rapid
rapid
round.
fire.
Okay, one. Response to Dak Shepard podcast.
Yeah.
There's lots going on there, and we don't have time to get into it, but quickly,
Yeah.
How do you handle your public composure when addressing people you know and are separate advocates? So I think a little bit, this is like an inter-community question. How do you handle people within community and dealing with, public composure? I don't think you can answer that quickly, but we'll try.
Well, so are those two separate questions, or that's all one
That
question?
is one question.
Oh, that's one question. Got
Yes.
it. Okay. Yeah, the public composure.
Or whatever you'd like to say about any of the things I just
About
asked
any
you.
of those things, yeah. I think so my book, Above All Else, yes, it's an intersex story. Yes, it's a guide to becoming an activist. It's a lot of different things. But above all, I like to say it's a blueprint for healing. I talk about what healing has looked like for me. It has involved exercise, which I know it has for you. It's involved tattoos, as we talked about. It's involved certain plant medicines. It's involved a lot of talk therapy. Like, I've had to put in a lot of work to be where I am today. And when you do talk about how we need to take rests and take breaks from being an activist, one thing I talked about on JVN's podcast, because I'd rather talk about that than Dax Shepard's podcast.
Fair.
Let's lift up the good. On JVN's podcast, most recently, JVN and I talked about how the queer community in general is like so traumatized, and it makes sense. We're targeted all the time. But if we each first chose to focus on healing ourselves before we started advocating and getting involved in all these spaces, then we would be vomiting so much less like crap all over each other all the time. And there would be so much less infighting, and there would be so much less scarcity mindset, and there would be so much less like, I really think like the reason I'm able to maintain public composure is because I've had a real commitment for many, many years to my own personal healing. And if you read in the book, I didn't used to have that public composure. Like my early days as a baby activist, I didn't have that. And I really credit all of that to the fact that like I feel really solid in who I am and what I'm about. And of course I have rough days, like we all have rough days, but I think having committed to my own healing enables me to show up as my best self and not a triggered self in all of these environments where I'm having to have these arguments with very triggering people.
Sure. I think that's important, and I think it's one of the things that not everybody has access to, right? And
Totally.
I think you and I both have that privilege of having access to
Yes.
therapy and being able to find a place to calm.
Yes.
But I also always like to remind people that if somebody gets angry when you are bigoted to them, that makes sense, right? And we should let
Totally.
people have those reactions. So
Yes.
even if you were to not have a calm composure when somebody is saying some bullshit to you, excuse my language, y'all have heard these
Totally.
words before, that
Yes.
would be valid.
Very,
Okay,
very
the other
much so.
rapid fire question,
Yes.
then the funny one.
Yeah.
How can we do better than the word assigned? Assigned at birth. It's entirely reliant on medical authority in a busy birth room for us intersex people that, I'm not saying this, I'm quoting this.
Yeah.
For us intersex people, that first glance at our junk turns out not to be our birth sex, yet we use assignment as a basis for cis or trans. We were just having this conversation.
Totally, yeah.
What's a better word?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say we should include gender on forms. We should include opportunities to declare things about your anatomy on forms that might affect your healthcare or might affect certain spaces that you're in. And we should have an opportunity to declare whether or not you're intersex. So what often happens, even in well-meaning spaces, like in queer clinics, they'll be like, okay, well, what's your gender? And then they'll be like, what's your sex assigned at birth? So my gender, I'm a woman. My sex assigned at birth was female because they put female on my birth certificate. But then that leaves them without knowing that I'm intersex, that I have XY chromosomes, that I was born with testes, that I underwent this surgery, that I need external hormones, that I don't menstruate. All this stuff is then just like not accounted for. So I think it's really, rather than saying like sex assigned at birth, you can say, like, what's your gender? Are you intersex? Is there anything you would like to tell us about your anatomy or medical history that might affect how we provide care?
I like it. Be specific, right?
Yeah.
Ask what you're actually curious about.
Ask what you're actually curious about.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Or don't, depending on who you are. Okay, the funny question. Any luck with Bad Bunny?
Okay, so y'all didn't read this, but I dedicated my book to Bad Bunny, and
To intersex kids and Bad Bunny.
Yeah, to intersex kids and Bad Bunny.
Don't forget about the intersex kids.
Yeah. No, all of the above, yes. And it is for intersex kids and it's for Bad Bunny. And then multiple times throughout the book, I'm like asking Bad Bunny to marry me. So you'll read that too. Yeah, no luck with him so far.
Okay. So anybody, the other way you can be an ally, right?
Yes.
To
Anyone
Alicia.
who has inroads.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Does
I know
anybody
he's with
Bad
Kendall
Bunny?
Jenner, but why not both?
Break the binary. Everybody, we're really glad that you're here. Alicia, I'm so grateful that you wrote this book and invited us into your experience. I want to close by sharing that for me, as somebody who even has learned about intersex folks before, and I think I probably come from like a hyper medicalized view because I learned about intersex people in school, which I think
Yeah.
is great, but also lacks humanity.
Yeah.
What struck me the most about your book was truly imagining your experiences and the sort of breaking of the binary, even from this biological standpoint. That I live in a much more gender standpoint as a
Yeah.
trans person, but to really think about what it means to break the biological sex binary, right, was deeply powerful, and I think can invite all of us into that expansiveness. So
Well,
thank you.
and trans and intersex solidarity is so important. We are such natural allies in this fight, right?
Absolutely.
We're all fighting for autonomy. We're all fighting for adequate health care. Again, any of us, trans, intersex, we're all fighting for the same things, y'all. So thanks for joining.
Thank you all so much for being here. Is there anything else you want to share before we go down to sign some books?
No, I'm excited to meet some of y'all at the book signing, so I'll see you downstairs.
Yeah, come by, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
James.
And thanks, James.
Let's keep it going, please, for Alicia and Schuyler. Thank you both so much for being here in Boston, for coming to the museum, and for sharing this conversation with us. Congrats on the book. Congrats on your upcoming release.
Yes,
you.
wait, Schuyler's book is available for pre-order and coming out
The 17th, next week.
next week.
Exciting. Yeah, 1
So
week.
get that too.
Yeah.
Yes, and thank you to all you for being here and joining us on a Tuesday night. Thank you to the Lowell Institute. We are going to say goodnight to our friends who are watching at home. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
And we'll see all of you downstairs for the book signing. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thanks so much to Museum Science and James as well.
Yes, thank you, James.
Yeah, you all are, I think, just doing such a great job of making sure you're having these conversations, and that's so
For
important.
sure.
So thank you so much.
Thank you, James. Woohoo!
All right.
Thank you.